Have you ever had the peculiar sensation of watching an entire society behave as though nothing is amiss while every signal around you suggests that something foundational is quietly collapsing? It's like standing in a theater where the stage lights flicker, the floorboards crack, and faint smoke curls out from behind the curtains. Yet the actors continue smiling, delivering their lines with unwavering confidence, as if the walls themselves weren't groaning. And the audience? They cheer, they clap, they laugh at the scripted jokes. Meanwhile, you sit there with the unmistakable feeling that the narrative you're watching is no longer aligned with the reality unfolding around it. That feeling, that inner rupture between what is presented and what is real, is becoming more widespread, especially among people who think deeply and refuse to numb their perception just to fit in. It's not depression, it's not anxiety, it's not negativity. It is the tension of lucidity in a culture that demands obedience to the performance. It's the strain of carrying awareness in a world that has built increasingly elaborate mechanisms to avoid confronting anything uncomfortable. For many, this sense of fracture begins subtly. Maybe it starts when you notice how conversations with others hover on the surface like water striders, never breaking tension, never diving beneath. Or maybe it hits you when someone asks, "How are you?" and you respond with the socially sanctioned good, even though everything inside you is saying, "I see through this. I see the instability. I feel the contradictions." The deeper your perception becomes, the harder it is to conform to expectations that require blindness as a prerequisite for participation. What you're experiencing is not a personal failing. It's not a flaw in your psychology. It's a natural response to the unprecedented conditions of our era. For the first time in human history, millions of people have access to the unfiltered mechanics of the world: economic structures, political corruption, environmental decline, institutional malfunctions, propaganda systems, psychological manipulations. Every layer of the global machine is now exposed, documented, analyzed, and accessible to anyone who cares to look. And the people who do look, who connect those dots, who cannot unsee once they've seen, are struggling to reconcile their insight with the strangely hypnotic normality around them. To understand how we arrived here, we need to remember that throughout history, societies have always relied on a balance between those who questioned and those who accepted. There were designated roles for thinkers, philosophers, scholars, scientists, mystics, observers, people whose purpose was to perceive and interpret reality beyond immediate survival. They asked questions others didn't. They challenged assumptions. They saw patterns invisible to the masses. But crucially, they also had spaces: monasteries, academic academies, public forums, revolutionary circles, artistic communities that legitimized their existence. They weren't always celebrated, but they were at least recognized. They were granted the cultural permission to question. In the modern world, that permission has eroded. The spaces that once nurtured depth have been steadily re-engineered for compliance. Universities increasingly prioritize marketability over inquiry. Media outlets chase virality instead of truth. Scientific institutions struggle beneath the weight of financial incentives. Philosophy is often buried under academic jargon, stripped of its existential fire. Art is commodified. Public discourse is gamified. And so, people whose natural orientation is to question find themselves intellectual nomads in a desert of superficiality. At the same time, the cognitive environment has transformed beyond anything our ancestors could have imagined. We live in an age of informational saturation, where truth coexists with noise, where data flows like a torrent, where the boundary between reality and performance has blurred. Those with strong analytical or intuitive abilities can discern patterns others miss: rising institutional fragility, systemic contradictions, psychological manipulation embedded In digital platforms, the escalating dissonance between what society says and what it actually does. And with that understanding comes discomfort. You begin to notice how political debates feel more like theatrical rivalries than genuine problem solving. How economic narratives mask inequalities that grow sharper every year. How environmental crises are acknowledged rhetorically but ignored structurally. How infinite growth models collide violently with finite planetary boundaries. How social media platforms reward outrage and tribal identity while suppressing nuance and uncertainty. How institutions make decisions not based on wisdom, but based on inertia and self-preservation. This recognition creates a quiet psychological exile. You aren't trying to be difficult. You aren't trying to be superior. You simply see what you see. But seeing makes you different in ways that are hard to articulate. How do you tell someone that the foundations of the world they're standing on are eroding when they are emotionally invested in believing those foundations are solid? How do you bring up structural fragility when your peers are trading memes? How do you talk about systemic problems when people prefer immediate gratifications from algorithm-curated dopamine feeds? You end up living in two worlds, the one everyone else participates in and the one you perceive beneath it. This dual existence is exhausting. It's like constantly translating between two languages, one shallow but socially acceptable, one deep but isolating. You feel the pressure to downplay your perceptions so you won't disturb the collective comfort. You become the person who thinks too much, who's too serious, who needs to relax, who shouldn't overanalyze everything. But what they call overanalysis, you call reality. This phenomenon is not evenly distributed across generations either. Young people face it acutely because they are inheriting systems that no longer function as promised. They were raised with narratives of meritocracy, but encounter obstacles shaped not by merit, but by structural inequality. They were taught that progress is linear, yet they witness climate instability, political polarization, economic precarity, and ecological tipping points. They see adults insisting everything will work out, while every metric suggests otherwise. Middle-aged people experience a more insidious form of the fracture. They often understand the dysfunctions but remain trapped by responsibilities. Mortgages, careers, children, aging parents, they know the game is flawed, but exiting it carries real risks. So they live with a quiet double consciousness, outward compliance, inward dissent. Older generations face a different psychological challenge, the possibility that the institutions they dedicated decades to may not have upheld the values they believed in. Confronting this requires immense courage. Many simply decline to look, choosing familiarity over truth. Across these groups, one common thread emerges: the consciousness trap. The more clearly you understand the systems around you, the less authentically you can participate in them, but the more deeply those systems entangle your survival, the harder it becomes to disengage. This is not laziness. This is structural entrapment. And yet something else is happening too. Something transformative, something subtle but powerful. All across the world, people who feel this discomfort are beginning to find each other. Not through traditional institutions, but through new networks, alternative communities, decentralized systems, creative movements, technological innovations, and philosophical conversations that bypass old filters. These individuals share something fundamental: a commitment to honesty, a refusal to accept shallow narratives, a longing for meaningful connection, and a desire to build systems rooted in integrity rather than illusion. We are witnessing the early stages of a cultural mutation. This emerging consciousness transcends conventional political divides. It isn't left or right. It isn't progressive or conservative. It isn't religious or secular. It is post-tribal, post-ideological, post-performance. It is grounded in direct perception. What is actually happening, not what we are told should be happening. It is grounded in responsibility, what we can do, not who we can blame. It is grounded in truth, even when truth is uncomfortable, even when it challenges identity, even when it breaks familiar narratives. People aligned with this consciousness are beginning to reshape how communities form, how work is organized, how knowledge is shared, how decisions are made, how resources are distributed, how meaning is cultivated. They are building parallel systems. Regenerative agriculture initiatives, decentralized finance, community-based education, cooperative ownership models, independent journalism platforms, mental health collectives, restorative justice groups, ecological restoration efforts, and countless other quiet revolutions. These efforts are small, but they are seeds. And seeds always begin in silence, beneath the soil, invisible to those still looking only at the surface. Yet the path is not easy. The psychological toll remains real. Relationships become fragile when one person's awareness expands in ways the other cannot follow. Conversations become strained. You begin filtering yourself to avoid conflict. You feel alienated at social gatherings. You struggle to explain your discomfort without sounding dramatic. You carry a loneliness that is difficult to articulate. But here's the crucial insight. You are not malfunctioning. Your perceptions are not the problem. You are adapting to a world that is outgrowing its old narratives and doing so faster than most people around you. You are experiencing the psychological equivalent of growing pains at the civilizational level. All transitions feel like chaos from the inside. There is no handbook for living at the edge of historical transformation, but there are principles that can help. First, hold your clarity gently. Insight becomes harmful only when it hardens into bitterness. Let your awareness guide you, not isolate you. You don't have to convince everyone. You don't have to wake anyone up. Consciousness is not contagious through force, it spreads through resonance. Second, find others who see. Even one or two like-minded people can provide psychological oxygen. You don't need a crowd, you need connection, true connection, real dialogue, intellectual honesty, emotional safety. Find people who value depth. Build alliances grounded in truth, not convenience. Third, create instead of collapsing. Awareness without action corrodes the spirit. But action does not always mean grand change. It means alignment, living in ways that reflect your understanding, contributing where you can, supporting alternatives, nurturing possibilities. Even small acts of integrity contribute to larger transformations. Fourth, do not try to force awakening. Most people awaken gradually, when their internal narratives can no longer reconcile with external realities. You cannot push them. You can only embody clarity and compassion, making yourself a lighthouse rather than a drill instructor. Fifth, preserve your inner life. In a world built on distraction, depth is rebellion, reflection is rebellion, stillness is rebellion. These practices allow your awareness to stabilize, preventing it from turning into despair. Finally, remember that your discomfort is meaningful. It is a sign that you are aligned with truth rather than illusion. It is the internal signal of a world that is beginning to crack open. You are not the problem. You are responding to a problem, and perhaps in ways we do not yet fully understand. Your refusal to pretend may be the very thing that helps humanity navigate what comes next. Because the future will not be built by those who cling to illusions, it will be built by those who face reality with courage and imagination. So if you feel the rupture, the restlessness, the inability to participate in the performance, know this: you are part of a growing wave of people who see clearly in a time when clarity is rare. You are part of a transition. You are part of an awakening. And you are not alone. Have you ever had the sensation that you're living inside a story that no longer believes in itself? A story whose characters continue reciting their lines with confidence even though the script has been shredded and the stage has begun to crumble? There is an eerie stillness that settles in when you realize that the narratives guiding society have lost their internal coherence. Yet the rituals continue, the ceremonies continue, the conversations continue, as if momentum alone can hold reality together indefinitely. This strange, disorienting gap between appearance and truth is widening. And those who feel it most intensely are not the apathetic or the oblivious, but the people who think deeply, those who sense fractures beneath the surface, long before they become visible to the majority. More and more, these individuals are experiencing a peculiar kind of existential vertigo, an inner awareness that something profound is shifting, paired with the outer observation that almost no one around them seems willing to acknowledge it. This speech is for them, for you, if you recognize this sensation, for the ones who cannot numb themselves into complacency, for the ones whose minds refuse to shrink to fit dysfunctional structures, for the ones who see patterns forming that others have been trained not to notice, for the ones who experience lucidity not as a gift, but as a daily challenge. We live in an age where clarity has become a double-edged sword. On one side, it allows you to see what is breaking. On the other side, it forces you to live among people who insist that nothing is breaking at all. This dissonance is not an anomaly. It's becoming one of the defining psychological conditions of our era. To understand why, we must examine the unprecedented forces shaping human consciousness today. For thousands of years, societies functioned on a delicate interplay between mythology and structure. Myths provided meaning, structures provided order, and within that system, there were always individuals whose role was to question, to challenge, to reinterpret, to stretch the boundaries of collective awareness. They didn't always fit neatly within their societies, but they were essential. They provided the reflective capacity, the philosophical backbone, the visionary spark. But today, something has shifted in a way humanity has never experienced before. The pace of change has accelerated far faster than the pace of collective adaptation. Old narratives are collapsing faster than new ones can form. Institutional trust is decaying. Community coherence is thinning. Digital environments are fragmenting attention. Economic systems are stretching their own limits. Ecological boundaries are being breached. And beneath all this, individuals are absorbing more information in a single week than previous generations encountered in a year. The human psyche was not designed for this. And so we are watching the emergence of a new mental landscape, one where people who see clearly are finding themselves increasingly alienated, overwhelmed, or quietly disillusioned. What does it feel like to live with this awareness? It feels like walking through a city of sleepwalkers while carrying the weight of realities no one else wants to take responsibility for. It feels like trying to have a conversation about structural collapse with someone who wants to talk about celebrity gossip. It feels like noticing how fragile our systems are while others marvel at the newest phone color. It feels like being lucid in a dream that everyone else insists is real. This isn't arrogance. It isn't elitism. It isn't self-importance. It is simply the consequence of heightened perception in a culture that rewards distraction. But there is another dimension to this burden. Those who see systemic dysfunction early are often the first to feel its emotional and existential impacts. They sense instability in institutions long before the media acknowledges it. They feel ecological anxiety before the weather itself begins to scream. They see the political polarization before the first social fractures become visible. They see the social fabric thinning, the trust eroding, the coherence dissolving, not through pessimism, but through observation, And because they see it early, they feel it alone. This loneliness is amplified by something else, something quieter, something psychological. Many of these perceptive individuals grew up believing that society structures were, at their core, shaped by wisdom and competence. They assumed that those in positions of authority were guided by depth, foresight, and an understanding of long-term consequences. But as they grew older, they discovered something darker. Much of modern society is not guided by wisdom at all, but by momentum, short-term incentives, institutional inertia, and the emotional comfort of simplistic answers. This realization breaks something inside a person. It is not easy to accept that the systems shaping your life are less stable, less ethical, and less rational than you were taught to believe. Many people avoid this truth instinctively because acknowledging it requires a restructuring of their identity. It requires grieving. It requires confronting uncertainty. But those with strong analytical abilities don't have the luxury of avoidance. Their minds probe, question, analyze, connect, synthesize. They can't help it. They see contradictions. They recognize patterns. They detect manipulations. And they eventually reach conclusions that others reach only after crisis forces them to. This gap between the aware and the unaware is widening. And inside that widening gap, a new psychological struggle has emerged. The struggle to remain sane, authentic, and compassionate while living in a collective trance. This challenge manifests in different ways. 1. Social exhaustion. Conversations become draining because they require constant self-censorship. You must pretend to see what you see. Pretend not to question what you question. Pretend to care about things that feel trivial in comparison to pressing existential shifts. 2. Relationship fractures. Depth can become a threat in relationships where one person is awakening and the other is committed to status quo thinking. This leads to emotional distance, unspoken frustrations, and a sense that genuine intimacy is impossible without shared perception. 3. Professional dissonance. Working within institutions that reward compliance over truth becomes increasingly painful. Intelligent, sensitive people often feel morally compromised simply by doing their jobs in systems that perpetuate harm or conceal reality. 4. Existential fatigue. Constant awareness becomes exhausting. It becomes tempting to disengage, to retreat, to numb yourself, to abandon hope. But your mind won't let you fully disconnect because understanding brings responsibility. This is not a personal failure. It is a natural response to an unnatural environment. Consider for a moment what modern society demands from you. Constant productivity in an economy that undermines well-being. Constant optimism in a world where problems are structural, not personal. Constant positivity when systems reward exploitation. Constant conformity to narratives that no longer reflect real conditions. Most people cope with these through denial, distraction, or dependency. But those who see clearly cannot rely on those mechanisms. Their minds reject illusio. NS, the way healthy bodies reject toxins. So again, this clarity becomes a burden. But here's the paradox. Clarity is also the first step toward transformation. If no one sees the cracks, no one can repair the structure. If no one sees the patterns, no one can interrupt them. If no one sees the failures, no one can correct them. If no one sees the future forming, no one can prepare for it. The people who feel most alienated today may be the ones carrying the seeds of tomorrow's solutions. And indeed, something is already happening beneath the surface. While traditional institutions crumble, new forms of community and new forms of consciousness are quietly emerging. People are beginning to form decentralized networks of meaning, spaces outside of old hierarchies, where depth is not punished and clarity is not pathologized. These emerging communities share common values: intellectual honesty, emotional maturity, systems thinking, ecological awareness, decentralized collaboration, deep responsibility, commitment to truth, even when uncomfortable. These are not movements in the conventional sense. They are not political parties, not religious sects, not ideological echo chambers. They are organic networks, adaptive, fluid, resilient. In these spaces, people can speak openly about the contradictions they perceive without being dismissed as negative or too intense. They can question deeply without being labeled troublemakers. They can discuss systemic problems without being accused of pessimism. They can share awareness without being told to just relax. In these spaces, clarity is not a burden. It is a shared language. This is how cultural evolution always begins. Small groups of people who see beyond the limits of their era begin to build alternatives, often quietly and without recognition. At first, they appear fringe, eccentric, or overly idealistic. But slowly, as the old systems falter under their own contradictions, these alternatives gather strength. You may already be part of this emerging shift without realizing it. Your discomfort is not random. It is a response to a world that is outgrowing its own foundations. Your awareness is not an accident. It is part of a broader awakening. But this awakening requires one more critical insight. You cannot navigate this new world alone. Lucidity without community leads to despair. Awareness without connection leads to isolation. Insight without collaboration leads to burnout. If you feel the weight of your perception, the answer is not to dim your awareness. It is to find those who can hold its weight alongside you. There are millions of people right now, across continents, cultures, professions, and generations, who are sensing the same fractures, feeling the same tensions, noticing the same patterns. They may not use the same words, but they share the same internal experience, the refusal to pretend. And when people who refuse to pretend find each other something extraordinary,